The silence in the military academy dining hall was deafening. 3 young cadets stood frozen, their faces drained of color as they stared at the woman they had just humiliated moments before. The cruel laughter that had echoed through the room died instantly when someone whispered 2 words that changed everything: Navy SEAL. What started as another day of hazing and mockery had just become the most important lesson these cadets would ever learn. The quiet woman sitting alone at the corner table, the one they thought was an easy target, carried scars that told stories of courage they couldn't even imagine. Her calm response to their taunts wasn't weakness. It was the controlled strength of someone who had faced real enemies in the darkest corners of the world. This is the story of how 3 arrogant young men learned that heroes don't always look the way you expect them to, and that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who never needs to prove it. The autumn morning air was crisp as Sarah Martinez walked through the gates of Highland Military Academy for the first time as an instructor. At 32, she looked younger than her years, standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her civilian clothes, dark jeans and a navy sweater, made her blend in with the visiting parents rather than stand out as faculty. Sarah had specifically chosen to dress down for her first day. After 8 years in the Navy, including 4 years with the SEALs in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, she understood the value of not drawing attention to yourself. She preferred to observe first, assess the situation, and then decide how to proceed. It was a habit that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. The academy sprawled across 200 acres of pristine Virginia countryside, red brick buildings with white columns lined perfectly manicured walkways, where cadets in crisp uniforms moved with military precision. Everything was polished, orderly, and designed to impress. It was a far cry from the muddy forward operating bases and bombed-out buildings where Sarah had spent much of her 20s. As she made her way to the administration building, Sarah noticed the curious glances from students and faculty. She was used to it by now. People often looked twice when they first met her, trying to reconcile her unremarkable appearance with her extraordinary background. Most assumed she was a secretary, a nurse, or maybe a teacher's aide. Very few guessed that she had been one of the first women to complete Navy SEAL training and serve in combat operations. The transition from active duty to civilian life had been challenging. After her final deployment ended with an IED explosion that left her with a permanently damaged left knee and severe PTSD, Sarah had struggled to find her place in the world. The nightmares, the hypervigilance, and the constant feeling of being an outsider had nearly broken her. It took 2 years of therapy and the unwavering support of her husband Marcus, a former Marine she had met during rehabilitation, to help her find stability again. Teaching at Highland had seemed like the perfect opportunity. The academy had a reputation for excellence, and their request for someone to develop a new leadership and survival skills program aligned perfectly with Sarah's expertise. She could share what she had learned without having to relive the trauma of combat. At least, that was what she hoped. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the academy's director, greeted Sarah in the main lobby. She was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and an authoritative presence that commanded respect without effort. Ms. Martinez, welcome to Highland, Dr. Hoffman said, extending her hand. I can't tell you how excited we are to have someone with your background joining our faculty. Thank you, ma'am. I'm looking forward to getting started, Sarah replied, her handshake firm but brief. As they walked through the corridors, Dr. Hoffman explained the academy's philosophy and structure. Highland Military Academy was a private institution that prepared young people for military service and leadership roles in civilian life. The student body consisted of about 400 cadets, ranging from 14 to 18 years old, with roughly equal numbers of boys and girls. Our students come from all walks of life, Dr. Hoffman explained. Some are here because their parents want to instill discipline and structure. Others are working toward military academy appointments. And some, she paused, are here because traditional schools haven't worked out for them. They passed groups of cadets in the hallways, all wearing identical grey uniforms with various insignia indicating their rank and year. The younger students moved with nervous energy, still adjusting to the military environment. The older ones carried themselves with confidence, their posture and bearing reflecting years of training. Sarah's keen eye picked up on the subtle dynamics at play. There were the natural leaders, the ones other cadets gravitated toward. There were the followers, content to blend in with the crowd. And there were the isolated ones, either by choice or circumstance, who seemed to exist on the periphery of the social structure. Your classroom is in the Tactical Studies building, Dr. Vised, Hoffman continued. You'll be working primarily with our senior cadets initially, though we hope to expand the program to younger students once it's established. The classroom was spacious and well-equipped, with modular furniture that could be rearranged for different activities. Large windows provided natural light, and one wall was covered with maps of various terrain types from around the world. Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she looked at a topographical map of Afghanistan, memories threatening to surface before she pushed them back down. "The curriculum outline you submitted was impressive," Dr. Hoffman said. "Leadership under pressure, team dynamics, survival psychology, these are exactly the kinds of skills our students need to develop. When do you plan to start?" "I'd like to spend a few days observing first, if that's all right," Sarah replied. "I want to understand the students and the existing culture before I introduce new elements." Dr. Hoffman nodded approvingly. "Excellent approach. Take all the time you need. I'll make sure you have access to observe any classes or activities you think would be helpful." After the orientation meeting, Sarah decided to grab lunch in the cadet dining hall. It was a massive room with long tables arranged in precise rows. The noise level was moderate. Cadets were allowed to talk during meals, but the atmosphere was more controlled than a typical school cafeteria. Sarah got her food and looked for an empty spot. Most tables were full, or had obvious social groupings that would be awkward for an outsider to join. She finally spotted a small table in the corner where she could sit alone and observe without being obtrusive. As she ate her salad and watched the interactions around her, Sarah began to identify the various cliques and power structures. There was definitely a hierarchy among the students that went beyond the official rank system. Some cadets commanded respect through natural charisma, others through intimidation, and a few through academic or athletic excellence. At a table near the center of the room, 3 senior cadets held court with a group of younger students hanging on their every word. The one in the middle, a tall blonde boy with perfect posture and multiple leadership ribbons on his uniform, was clearly the alpha of the group. His name tag read Davidson. To his right sat another senior cadet, darker-haired and stocky, whose name tag read Murphy. The third member of their inner circle was leaner and had an intensity in his eyes that reminded Sarah of some of the more dangerous people she had encountered overseas. His name tag read Collins. Davidson was telling a story about a recent training exercise, gesturing dramatically as he described how his team had outperformed all the others. His audience laughed at all the right moments and nodded appreciatively at his tactical insights. Sarah recognized the performance for what it was, a young man building his reputation and solidifying his position in the social hierarchy. And that's when I realized the other team leader had no idea what he was doing, Davidson said, his voice carrying clearly across the dining hall. "I mean, you can't just follow the manual in a real situation. You need instinct, experience, natural leadership ability." Murphy and Collins nodded in agreement, while the younger cadets looked suitably impressed. Sarah found herself studying their body language and speech patterns. These were the boys who would likely receive leadership positions after graduation, either in the military or in civilian careers. They had confidence, charisma, and the support of their peers. But Sarah also saw something that concerned her, an arrogance that came from never having their assumptions truly challenged. True leadership, Sarah knew, was forged in moments of genuine crisis when all your plans fell apart and people's lives depended on your decisions. These boys had participated in training exercises and simulations, but they had never faced real consequences for failure. They had never held a dying teammate in their arms or made split-second decisions that determined who lived and who died. After lunch, Sarah attended several classes to get a feel for the academic environment. The instructors were competent and the students generally engaged, though she noticed some of the same personality dynamics playing out in classroom settings. Davidson, Murphy, and Collins seemed to be in advanced classes across the board, and they dominated discussions with the same confidence they had shown at lunch. In the military history class, Davidson offered his analysis of various famous battles with the certainty of someone who had studied the subject extensively but never experienced combat personally. His insights were actually quite good, showing he had a solid understanding of strategy and tactics. But when he dismissed the importance of luck and chance in warfare, Sarah found herself wanting to speak up. "The thing about military history," Davidson said to the class, "is that the winning side usually wins because they had better leadership and preparation. Yes, there might be some random factors, but good commanders adapt and overcome." The instructor, a retired Army colonel named Peterson, nodded thoughtfully. "That's an excellent point, Cadet Davidson, though I would argue that luck plays a larger role than we sometimes like to admit. Even the best plans can be derailed by factors beyond anyone's control. But that's exactly when leadership matters most," Davidson countered. "A real leader doesn't make excuses about bad luck. He finds a way to win anyway." Sarah bit her tongue, remembering missions where everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, where good people had died despite perfect planning and exceptional leadership. The young man's confidence wasn't entirely misplaced, but his understanding was incomplete. Leadership in real combat meant accepting that sometimes there were no good options, that sometimes the best you could do was minimize casualties and complete whatever portion of the mission was still possible. After the academic day ended, Sarah walked around the campus to familiarize herself with the facilities. The athletic complex was impressive, with multiple gyms, a pool, and outdoor training areas. She watched some of the afternoon sports practices and noted which cadets emerged as natural leaders in competitive situations. Davidson was captain of the soccer team, and his on-field performance matched his classroom presence. He was skilled, confident, and had a talent for motivating his teammates. Murphy played rugby with aggressive enthusiasm, using his stocky build to good advantage. Collins was on the wrestling team, and Sarah could see that he had the same intensity in athletic competition that she had noticed during lunch. All three were undoubtedly talented young men with bright futures ahead of them. Under different circumstances, Sarah might have been impressed by their potential, but something about their interaction with other students bothered her. They weren't cruel exactly, but there was a casual dismissiveness in how they treated cadets they considered beneath them. Sarah saw it most clearly during a pickup basketball game in the main gym. A younger cadet, maybe 15 years old, had missed an easy shot that would have tied the game. As the players headed off the court, Sarah heard Davidson make a comment just loud enough for others to hear. "Maybe stick to chess club, Rodriguez. Team sports require a certain mental toughness." The younger boy's face flushed with embarrassment, but he didn't respond. The other players laughed, not necessarily because they found it funny, but because laughing with Davidson was safer than standing up for Rodriguez. Sarah felt a familiar anger rising in her chest. She had seen this dynamic before, both in civilian settings and in military units. There were always people who built themselves up by tearing others down, who mistook cruelty for strength and intimidation for leadership. In combat, those kinds of leaders got people killed. As evening approached, Sarah made her way back to the parking lot. Her first day had been informative, giving her a good sense of the social dynamics and academic culture she would be working within. She had identified several promising students who might benefit from her leadership program, as well as some potential challenges. The three senior cadets who had caught her attention represented both an opportunity and a concern. They clearly had leadership potential, and would likely be influential in whatever careers they chose. But their understanding of true leadership was shallow, based more on dominance and control than on service and sacrifice. Sarah's job would be to challenge their assumptions without breaking their confidence, to teach them that real strength came from lifting others up rather than putting them down. It would require patience, wisdom, and careful planning. Most importantly, it would require her to draw on experiences she preferred not to remember. As she drove home to the small house she shared with Marcus, Sarah reflected on the day. The academy was impressive, the students were bright, and the opportunity to make a positive impact was real. But she also sensed that her time at Highland would test her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The nightmares that evening were particularly vivid, filled with the sounds of explosions and the faces of teammates who hadn't made it home. But for the first time in months, they were mixed with new images, young faces looking to her for guidance, and the possibility that her experiences, however painful, might finally serve a constructive purpose. Marcus found her on the back porch at 3 a.m, staring at the stars and trying to shake off the lingering effects of the dreams. "How was the first day?" he asked gently, settling into the chair beside her. "Complicated," Sarah replied, "but important. The kid's going to be okay." Sarah thought about Davidson, Murphy, and Collins, about Rodriguez and the other students who seemed to exist in their shadow. "I think so, but some of them need to learn what leadership really means before they hurt someone. And you're the one to teach them?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the path that had brought her to this point. "I hope so. I really hope so." Sarah's second week at Highland Military Academy began with her first official class. She had spent the previous days observing and planning, developing a curriculum that would challenge the students while remaining grounded in practical reality. The Leadership and Survival Skills program was designed to strip away the comfortable assumptions most of these young people held about themselves and the world. 24 senior cadets filed into her classroom that Tuesday morning, including Davidson, Murphy, and Collins. Sarah had specifically requested a mix of different personality types and leadership styles, wanting to create a dynamic that would force students to work with people outside their usual social circles. "Good morning," Sarah said simply, standing at the front of the room in dark cargo pants and a plain grey shirt. She had deliberately chosen casual clothing to reinforce that this class would be different from their traditional academic subjects. "Please take a seat anywhere you'd like. We won't be using assigned seating in this program. The students settled in with the casual confidence of seniors who had navigated the academy's social structure for years. Davidson naturally gravitated toward the center of the room, with Murphy and Collins flanking him. Other cadets arranged themselves in a rough hierarchy, with the more confident students closer to the front and the quieter ones toward the back. Sarah noticed Rodriguez, the young cadet she had seen humiliated during the basketball game, sitting in the far corner. She also spotted Maria Santos, a serious-faced girl who had impressed her during classroom observations, and James Kim, whose academic records showed exceptional analytical thinking but limited social connections. Before we begin, I want each of you to write your name on a piece of paper along with one thing you think qualifies you to be a leader, Sarah said, distributing index cards. Don't overthink it. Just write the first thing that comes to mind. The students complied, some writing quickly while others paused to consider their responses. Sarah collected the cards and shuffled them before beginning to read them aloud without identifying who had written what. Team captain, class president, high GPA, natural charisma, people respect me, good at making decisions. Strong under pressure, born leader. She paused after reading each response, letting the words hang in the air. When she finished, she looked around the room at the expectant faces. Interesting answers, Sarah said. Now I want you to forget everything you just wrote. For the next 16 weeks, nothing you've accomplished before matters. Your rank, your grades, your athletic achievements, your family background. None of it has any relevance in this classroom. She could see the confusion and mild annoyance on several faces, particularly Davidson's. These students were accustomed to being defined by their achievements, and suddenly being told those achievements were meaningless was unsettling. Leadership isn't about titles or recognition, Sarah continued. It's not about being the smartest person in the room or the most popular. Real leadership is about serving others, making difficult decisions with incomplete information, and taking responsibility for outcomes even when they're not your fault. But surely experience matters, Davidson interjected, his tone respectful but challenging. I mean, someone who has proven they can lead a team effectively is more qualified than someone who hasn't. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Tell me about the most difficult leadership decision you've ever had to make. Davidson straightened, clearly confident in his answer. Last year, during the regional competition, our team was struggling in the war game scenario. The other team leaders wanted to play it safe and follow standard procedures, but I recognized that we needed to take a calculated risk. I convinced them to follow my alternative strategy, and we won the competition. What were the consequences if your strategy had failed? Sarah asked. We would have lost the competition, Davidson replied, looking slightly puzzled by the question. So the worst-case scenario was disappointment and maybe some embarrassment, Sarah said. What if I told you that real leadership decisions often involve choosing between options where people die regardless of what you choose? What if the question isn't whether your strategy will work, but whether it will result in 10 casualties or 50? The room had grown very quiet. Students shifted uncomfortably as they began to understand that this class would confront them with realities they had never considered. I'm not trying to diminish your accomplishments, Sarah said, her tone gentler now. Competition and academic success require genuine skills and dedication. But they also take place in controlled environments with clear rules and limited consequences. The leadership challenges you'll face in your careers, whether in the military or civilian world, will rarely be that clean. She walked to the whiteboard and wrote 3 words in large letters: unquestionable, responsibility, sacrifice. Every real leadership decision involves these 3 elements, she said. You almost never have complete information. You're always responsible for the welfare of others, not just your own success. And meaningful leadership requires giving up things you want for the benefit of those you serve. Maria Santos raised her hand. How do we prepare for situations like that if we've never experienced them? Excellent question, Sarah replied. We start by creating scenarios that strip away your comfort zone and force you to function under stress. We practice making decisions when you don't have enough time or information. And we learn to work with people you might not like or understand. She gestured to the seating arrangement. Look around this room. How many of you are sitting with people outside your usual social circle? The students glanced around and several looked uncomfortable as they realized they had instinctively segregated themselves into familiar groups. For our first exercise, I want you to form teams of 4 people each. But here's the catch. You cannot be on a team with anyone you consider a close friend. You need to work with people you don't know well, or don't usually interact with. The resistance was immediate and obvious. Students looked around uncertainly. clearly preferring to stick with their established relationships. Davidson, Murphy, and Collins exchanged glances, reluctant to split up their trio. "This is exactly what I'm talking about," Sarah said. "In real leadership situations, you don't get to choose your team. You work with whoever is available, and you find ways to succeed regardless of personal preferences or compatibility." Slowly, awkwardly, the students began to rearrange themselves. Sarah watched the process carefully, noting who adapted quickly and who struggled with the unfamiliar social dynamics. Rodriguez found himself grouped with Maria Santos and two other students he barely knew. Davidson ended up on a team with James Kim and two cadets from different social circles. "Your assignment is simple in concept but challenging in execution," Sarah said once the teams were formed. "Each team will be given a survival scenario. You have 30 minutes to develop a plan that maximizes your chances of survival and rescue. The catch is that you'll be given incomplete and sometimes contradictory information, and the scenario will change halfway through your planning time." She distributed folders containing the initial scenarios. Each team received a different situation: lost in the wilderness, trapped in a collapsed building, stranded on a life raft, isolated during a natural disaster. Davidson's team opened their folder to find themselves stranded in the Alaskan wilderness after a plane crash. They had limited supplies, unknown injuries among the survivors, and contradictory information about their location and the likelihood of rescue. "Okay, first things first," Davidson said, automatically taking charge. "We need to assess our supplies and establish priorities." James Kim looked up from reading the scenario details. "Actually, it says here that one of the survivors is unconscious with possible internal injuries. Shouldn't medical care be our first priority?" "We can't help anyone if we all freeze to death," Davidson replied. "Shelter and fire come first. But if someone is bleeding internally, time could be critical," Maria Santos interjected from the neighboring team, having overheard the discussion. Davidson's team was already experiencing the kind of conflict that Sarah had anticipated. In their normal social environment, Davidson's opinion would carry significant weight due to his established leadership role, but in this artificially constructed group, his authority was less clear. Sarah moved between the teams, listening to their discussions and noting the different approaches they were taking. Some teams immediately fell into traditional hierarchies based on existing social dynamics. Others struggled with decision-making as multiple members tried to assert leadership. A few found ways to distribute responsibilities based on individual strengths rather than social status. "The information says the weather is deteriorating," James Kim pointed out. "But it also says we can see a road in the distance. Do we try to reach the road or focus on staying put and signaling for help? Moving an unconscious person could kill them," said Rebecca Walsh, the fourth member of their team. She was a quiet student who rarely spoke up in other classes, but had strong opinions about medical priorities. Davidson felt his frustration rising. In his usual leadership roles, people listened to his decisions and implemented them efficiently. This group kept questioning and debating every choice, eating up valuable time without reaching consensus. "Look, we need to make a decision and stick with it," he said firmly. "Analysis paralysis will kill us faster than making an imperfect choice. But rushing into a bad decision could be even worse," James countered. "What if we move the injured person and cause permanent damage? What if we use our energy trying to reach the road and get caught in the open when the weather hits?" Sarah watched the interaction with interest. Davidson was experiencing real leadership friction for possibly the first time in his academic career. He was accustomed to commanding respect and having his decisions accepted without extended debate. But in a life-or-death scenario with unfamiliar teammates, his usual approach wasn't working. At the 15-minute mark, Sarah introduced the planned complication. "Time for an update," she announced. "Open the second envelope in your folders. The situation has changed." Davidson's team discovered that their radio, which they had been counting on for rescue communication, had stopped working. Additionally, they had discovered that one of the survivors had diabetes and would need insulin within the next 12 hours. "This changes everything," Rebecca said immediately. "We have to get to medical help quickly. But moving in deteriorating weather with an unconscious person is basically suicide," Davidson argued. "We should focus on creating the best possible shelter and hope the weather clears." "What about a compromise?" James suggested. "What if some of us stay with the injured people while others try to reach the road?" "That divides our resources and potentially puts more people at risk," Davidson replied. The debate continued, becoming more heated as the time pressure increased. Sarah could see that Davidson was becoming increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as inefficiency and indecisiveness from his teammates. His natural inclination was to make an executive decision and expect others to follow. But the artificial team structure was preventing that approach from working. Other teams were experiencing similar dynamics. Murphy's group had devolved into arguing about whether to ration their limited water supply or search for a new water source. Collins found himself in conflict with a quieter student who questioned his aggressive approach to their urban disaster scenario. With 5 minutes remaining, Sarah announced that teams needed to finalize their decisions. Davidson finally took charge through sheer force of personality, overriding his teammates' objections. "We're staying put and focusing on shelter. We'll signal for help and hope the weather clears before the diabetic gets critical." James and Rebecca exchanged frustrated glances but didn't continue the argument. They spent the remaining time planning their shelter construction and signaling strategy, but Sarah could tell the team dynamics remained tense. When time was called, each team presented their plan to the class. The presentations revealed interesting differences in both strategy and team functioning. Some groups had found ways to blend different perspectives into comprehensive plans. Others had fallen back on dominant personalities making unilateral decisions. "Interesting results," Sarah said after all teams had presented. "Now I want you to vote on which plan you think gives the best chance of survival." You cannot vote for your own team's plan. The voting was revealing. Davidson's team, despite their strong presentation, received only a few votes. The winning plan came from Rodriguez's team, which had developed a careful, methodical approach that addressed multiple contingencies without committing to unnecessarily risky actions. "Why do you think Rodriguez's team got the most votes?" Sarah asked. Maria Santos raised her hand. "They seemed to actually listen to each other, instead of just arguing. Their plan addressed more of the variables we were given. They also acknowledged uncertainty instead of pretending they knew more than they did," James Kim added, shooting a meaningful glance at Davidson. Sarah nodded. Rodriguez's team demonstrated something crucial about real leadership. They were willing to admit what they didn't know, they incorporated input from all team members, and they planned for multiple contingencies rather than betting everything on a single approach. Davidson's face flushed slightly. He wasn't accustomed to having his leadership approach criticized, especially not by students he considered less experienced or capable. But in a real emergency, you don't have time for endless discussion, he argued. Someone needs to take charge and make decisions quickly.
"You're absolutely right," Sarah replied. "The question is how you take charge."
Do you take charge by shutting down other perspectives and imposing your will? Or do you take charge by quickly gathering the best available information and making decisions that account for your team's capabilities and the situation's realities? She turned to address the entire class. True leadership isn't about having all the answers or being the smartest person in the room. It's about creating an environment where the best ideas can emerge and be implemented effectively, even under pressure. The class ended with a brief discussion of the lessons learned from the exercise. Sarah could see that some students, particularly those who were used to being followers, had gained confidence from seeing their input valued and incorporated. Others, especially those accustomed to leadership roles, seemed thoughtful and perhaps a bit unsettled. As students filed out, Davidson lingered behind with Murphy and Collins. "That was an interesting class," Davidson said carefully, "though I'm not sure the scenarios were entirely realistic."
"How so?"
Sarah asked. "Well, the team compositions were artificial. In real leadership situations, you usually work with people you know and trust, and some of the information we were given seemed designed to create conflict rather than reflect actual emergency conditions." Sarah studied the three young men. They were clearly intelligent and had genuine leadership potential, but they were also protected by their privileged position within the academy's social structure. They had rarely faced situations where their authority was questioned or their approaches challenged. "You make valid points," she said, "but consider this. In the military, you might be assigned to lead soldiers you've never met before. In civilian careers, you might find yourself managing teams of people with different backgrounds and perspectives, and in genuine emergencies, you rarely have complete or consistent information." "I understand that," Davidson replied, "but there's also value in proven leadership ability and established chain of command. If you constantly question authority and debate every decision, you can create paralysis when action is needed." "True," Sarah agreed. "The key is knowing when to debate and when to act, how to gather input efficiently without creating paralysis, and how to make decisions that people will follow even when they don't fully agree." Murphy, who had been quiet during the exchange, finally spoke up. "Have you ever been in real leadership situations like this? I mean, actual life or death scenarios?" Sarah paused, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever anyone asked about her background. She had been hoping to keep her military experience general and theoretical, focusing on principles rather than personal stories. "Yes," she said simply. I have. Where? Collins asked. His intensity focused on her answer. Afghanistan, Iraq, other places. Sarah kept her response brief, not wanting to elaborate. What branch? Murphy pressed. Sarah hesitated. She had known this moment would come eventually, but she had hoped to establish herself as an instructor before her SEAL background became known. Once students learned about her combat experience, it would change how they saw her and potentially make teaching more difficult. Navy? She said, still being deliberately vague. What was your job? Davidson asked, his curiosity clearly piqued. Sarah looked at the three young men standing before her. They were bright, confident, and accustomed to getting answers when they asked questions. They would find out about her background eventually, either through official channels or informal research. Special operations, she said finally. I was a SEAL. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. All three cadets' expressions changed from casual curiosity to shock. Murphy's mouth actually dropped open. Collins took a step back. Davidson stared at her, as if seeing her for the first time. You're a Navy SEAL? Davidson asked, his voice higher than usual. I was, Sarah corrected. I'm retired now. The silence that followed was awkward and loaded with unspoken questions. Sarah could see them processing this information, trying to reconcile her unremarkable appearance and quiet demeanor with their preconceptions about what a Navy SEAL should look like. How many women are Navy SEALs? Murphy asked. Not many, Sarah replied. The program only opened to women a few years ago, Collins found his voice. What kind of missions did you do? Sarah felt the familiar weight of memories pressing against her consciousness. Images of night raids, firefights, and faces of teammates who hadn't made it home threatened to surface. The kind that are still classified, she said firmly. And the kind I prefer not to discuss in detail. The three cadets exchanged glances, clearly impressed but also uncertain how to process this information. Their new instructor, who had just critiqued their leadership approaches, was suddenly revealed to be someone with credentials they could barely comprehend. Does this change how you think about today's exercise? Sarah asked. Davidson considered the question seriously. I guess it means you probably know what you're talking about when it comes to leadership under pressure. But it doesn't make my approaches wrong, he added quickly, defensive about having his methods questioned. Different situations require different leadership styles. You're absolutely right, Sarah agreed. And part of what we'll explore in this program is how to recognize which situations require which approaches. Today's exercise was just the beginning. As the three cadets left the classroom, Sarah could hear them talking in low voices in the hallway. She knew that word would spread quickly through the student body. By tomorrow, every cadet would know that their new leadership instructor was a former Navy SEAL. She wasn't sure if that would make her job easier or harder, but she was certain it would make it different. The comfortable anonymity she had enjoyed during her first week was gone. Now she would have to deal with students' preconceptions about what a Navy SEAL should be like, their assumptions about her experiences, and their curiosity about stories she preferred not to tell. Sarah began erasing the whiteboard and organizing her materials for the next class. Outside, she could see cadets moving between buildings with their usual purposeful energy. Some of them would be natural leaders regardless of the training they received. Others would need guidance and encouragement to develop their potential. And a few might never be suited for significant leadership responsibilities, despite their current confidence and social status. Her job was to help all of them understand the difference between authority and leadership, between commanding respect and earning it, and between making decisions and making good decisions. The revelation of her SEAL background would certainly change the dynamics, but the fundamental mission remained the same. As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah reflected on the day's lessons. The exercise had revealed important information about her students' approaches to problem-solving, teamwork, and decision-making under pressure. It had also shown her which students would be most challenging to teach, and which ones might benefit most from a different perspective on leadership. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to plant seeds that might grow into genuine leadership ability. But first, she had to figure out how to manage a classroom full of teenagers who now saw her as either a hero or a curiosity, when all she wanted to be was an effective teacher. Word traveled fast through Highland Military Academy. By the next morning, every cadet knew that Miss Martinez, the quiet woman who had seemed so unremarkable during her first week, was actually a former Navy SEAL. The revelation transformed her from an unknown quantity into a figure of intense curiosity and speculation. Sarah arrived at school to find clusters of students talking in hushed voices, their conversations stopping abruptly when she passed. She overheard fragments of whispered discussions about her background, most of which bore little resemblance to reality. Some students claimed she had been a sniper who had killed dozens of terrorists. Others said she had been captured and tortured but had escaped after killing her guards. A few insisted she had been part of the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. The attention made Sarah deeply uncomfortable. She had spent years learning to blend in, to avoid drawing notice to herself. The sudden celebrity status felt like being under constant surveillance. Every gesture and expression analyzed for signs of her supposed warrior nature. In her second leadership class that week, the dynamic was completely different from the first session. Students who had barely paid attention before now hung on her every word. Questions that had seemed theoretical suddenly carried weight because they came from someone who had supposedly lived through unimaginable experiences. Today we're going to discuss decision-making under extreme stress, Sarah began, trying to maintain the same teaching approach despite the changed atmosphere. Can anyone give me an example of a high-stress decision from your own experience? Hands shot up around the room. Previously reluctant students were eager to participate, apparently hoping to impress their newly revealed SEAL instructor. I had to decide whether to call a penalty shot during the state championship soccer match, offered Jennifer Hayes, a typically quiet student. The other team's player committed a foul in the penalty box, but the referee didn't see it. I could have gone down and probably gotten a call, but I stayed on my feet because I thought it was more important to win fairly. Sarah nodded approvingly. That's actually an excellent example of ethical decision-making under pressure. You had to choose between personal advantage and personal integrity in a split second. What factors influenced your decision? As the discussion continued, Sarah noticed that Davidson, Murphy, and Collins were uncharacteristically quiet. They seemed to be studying her more than participating in the class, as if trying to detect signs of the warrior they now knew her to be. The exercise for the day involved teams working through a scenario where they were in charge of evacuating civilians from a disaster zone. Each team was given different constraints and complications, requiring them to make rapid decisions with incomplete information while balancing competing priorities. Davidson's team found themselves responsible for evacuating a hospital during a hurricane. They had limited transportation, a mix of patients with different medical needs, and conflicting information about which evacuation routes were still passable. We need to prioritize the patients who are most likely to survive the transport, Davidson declared, falling back on his decisive leadership style. Focus on the mobile patients first, then work our way down to the critical cases. But that means abandoning the patients who need help most, protested Rebecca Walsh. Isn't our job to save everyone we can? In an ideal world, yes, Davidson replied. But we have to be realistic about our capabilities. If we try to save everyone, we might end up saving no one. Sarah moved between teams, listening to their debates and noting how they approached the ethical dilemmas built into the scenarios. She was pleased to see that most teams were wrestling with the moral complexity rather than simply choosing the most expedient options. But as she listened to Davidson's team, she became increasingly concerned about their discussion. Davidson was making utilitarian calculations about human worth that showed a disturbing lack of empathy. His arguments were logically sound but emotionally cold, treating patients as problems to be solved rather than people to be served. The elderly patients are the highest risk for transport complications, he continued. We should focus our limited resources on younger patients who have better survival odds. You're talking about leaving old people to die, Rebecca said, her voice rising. How is that different from murder? It's not murder, it's triage, Davidson replied dismissively. Doctors make these kinds of decisions every day in emergency rooms. You save the patients you can save and accept that you can't save everyone. James Kim looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Maybe there's a middle ground. What if we try to transport some high-risk patients but also focus on getting help to the hospital? Coordinate with other rescue teams instead of trying to do everything ourselves? That's inefficient and overly optimistic, Davidson said. We can't count on resources we don't control. Sarah felt her jaw tighten as she listened to the debate. Davidson's approach wasn't entirely wrong from a tactical perspective. Difficult decisions were often necessary in emergency situations. But his casual dismissal of human dignity and his teammates' concerns revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what leadership meant. The exercise concluded with teams presenting their evacuation plans. Davidson's team had developed an efficient system that would save the maximum number of lives based on statistical probabilities. It was logically sound but morally questionable, and his presentation showed no awareness of the ethical concerns his teammates had raised. When Rodriguez's team presented their plan, it was immediately clear that they had taken a different approach. Their evacuation strategy was more complex and potentially less efficient, but it included provisions for attempting to help all patients while accepting that some attempts might fail. We decided that we couldn't live with ourselves if we didn't at least try to save everyone, Rodriguez explained. Our plan might save fewer people overall, but we wouldn't be abandoning anyone without making an effort. The class discussion that followed revealed a clear divide in philosophical approaches. Some students favored Davidson's utilitarian efficiency, while others supported Rodriguez's more inclusive but potentially less effective strategy. There's no clearly right answer in these scenarios, Sarah said after listening to both perspectives. But I want you to think about this. The decisions you make in crisis situations don't just affect outcomes. They shape who you become as leaders and as people. She turned to Davidson. Your plan would likely save the most lives. But what does it do to the rescue workers who have to leave conscious patients behind? What does it do to your ability to look at people as individuals rather than statistics? Davidson shifted uncomfortably. Sometimes leaders have to make hard choices. If you can't handle the emotional cost, maybe you shouldn't be in charge during emergencies. Handling the emotional cost doesn't mean ignoring it, Sarah replied. Good leaders feel the weight of their decisions, even when those decisions are necessary. The moment you stop caring about the individual human cost is the moment you stop being a leader and start being a calculator. Murphy, who had been quiet throughout the class, finally spoke up. But ma'am, didn't you have to make decisions like this in combat? Decisions where people died no matter what you chose? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest as memories threatened to surface. She could see that the students were waiting for her to share war stories, to validate their assumptions about what combat leadership really looked like. Yes, she said quietly, I made decisions where people died. The room was completely silent. Even students who hadn't been paying attention were now focused on her intently. And every one of those deaths stays with you, Sarah continued. Every face, every name, every family that got a flag instead of their loved one coming home. The weight of those decisions doesn't go away when the mission ends. It becomes part of who you are. She looked directly at Davidson. The worst leaders I knew in combat were the ones who stopped feeling that weight. They became efficient at getting missions accomplished. But they stopped seeing their teammates as human beings. They stopped questioning their own judgment. And eventually, they started making bad decisions because they had lost touch with what they were fighting for. Davidson's face flushed. I'm not saying we should stop caring about people. I'm saying we need to be practical about what we can accomplish. Then explain to me how your plan addressed your teammates' concerns about abandoning conscious patients, Sarah challenged. What did you do to incorporate their perspectives into your decision-making process? Davidson was quiet for a moment, clearly uncomfortable with being put on the spot.
Their concerns were noted, but ultimately someone has to make the final decision.
Actually, someone has to make a decision that the team can implement effectively, Sarah corrected. If half your team thinks you're abandoning your moral responsibilities, how effectively do you think they'll execute your plan? The question was rhetorical, but it highlighted a crucial point about leadership that Davidson seemed to be missing. Command authority could force compliance, but it couldn't create the kind of dedicated teamwork that was necessary in truly challenging situations. After class, Sarah was grading papers in her office when she heard voices in the hallway outside. She recognized Davidson, Murphy, and Collins discussing the day's lesson. I think she's trying to make us feel guilty about making tough decisions, Murphy was saying. Like we're supposed to let emotions override logic. Maybe that works in her world, but in the real world, leaders have to be willing to make unpopular choices, Davidson added. You can't save everyone, and pretending you can is just naive idealism. I don't know, Collins said thoughtfully. Some of what she said made sense. If your team doesn't trust your judgment or buy into your decisions, that's a real problem. The team doesn't have to like the decisions, Davidson replied. They just have to follow them. Sarah felt a surge of frustration. These young men were intelligent and capable, but they were completely missing the point of the leadership lessons. They saw authority as a tool for imposing their will rather than a responsibility to serve others. The next week, Sarah decided to try a different approach. Instead of theoretical scenarios, she arranged for the class to participate in a practical exercise at a local community center. They would spend the day working with underprivileged children, helping with tutoring and recreational activities. This isn't exactly a survival scenario, Maria Santos observed as they arrived at the center. No, Sarah agreed, but it's a leadership scenario. You'll be working with children who have challenging backgrounds, limited resources, and potentially behavioral issues. Your job is to make their day better while maintaining order and safety. The community center served kids from some of the poorest neighborhoods in the county. Many of the children had experienced trauma, lived in unstable housing situations, or lacked consistent adult supervision. They were bright and energetic, but often struggled with authority and had difficulty trusting adults. Sarah watched as the cadets interacted with the children. Some adapted quickly, getting down to the kids' level and finding ways to connect through games and activities. Others struggled with the chaos and unpredictability, trying to impose military-style order on situations that required flexibility and patience. Davidson attempted to organize a group of 8-year-olds into a structured activity, but his authoritative approach immediately created resistance. The kids sensed his discomfort and began testing boundaries, becoming increasingly disruptive. "Listen up," Davidson said firmly. "We're going to play a game, but everyone needs to follow the rules and stay in line." "Why?" demanded a small girl named Keisha. "You're not our teacher." "Because I'm in charge right now," Davidson replied, his frustration already showing. "The game only works if everyone cooperates." "But games are supposed to be fun," protested a boy named Marcus. "You're making it sound like work." Meanwhile, Rodriguez had gathered a group of older kids and was successfully engaging them in a storytelling activity. He wasn't trying to control them so much as channel their energy into something positive. When kids interrupted or went off on tangents, he incorporated their input rather than shutting it down. "What happens next in the story?" Rodriguez asked, letting a shy girl add her ideas to the narrative. "The dragon should be nice, not mean," she suggested. "Great idea," Rodriguez responded. "How do you think the villagers figure out that the dragon is actually trying to help them?" Sarah observed the interactions with growing clarity about her students' different leadership styles. Some, like Rodriguez and Maria Santos, seemed to understand instinctively that leading children required patience, creativity, and the ability to make them feel heard and valued. Others, particularly Davidson and his circle, kept trying to impose adult expectations on child behavior. The day's crisis came when a fight broke out between two boys during lunch. 9-year-old Jalen had been teasing 6-year-old Anthony about his worn-out shoes, and Anthony had responded by shoving Jalen into a table. Both boys were crying, other children were taking sides, and the noise level was rising toward chaos. Davidson immediately moved to separate the boys and restore order. "That's enough," he said firmly, grabbing both boys by the shoulders. "Sit down and be quiet until we sort this out." "He started it," Jalen protested, pointing at Anthony. "He pushed me." "I don't care who started it," Davidson replied. "Fighting is not acceptable behavior." But his authoritative approach only escalated the situation. Both boys became more agitated, other children began choosing sides more vocally, and the disruption was spreading throughout the room. Rodriguez approached the situation differently. Instead of immediately taking control, he knelt down to get on the boys' level and spoke quietly to them. "Looks like both of you are pretty upset," he said calmly. "Jalen, can you tell me what happened? And Anthony, you'll get your turn to explain too." The change in approach was immediately effective. The boys responded to being heard rather than commanded, and the emotional temperature of the situation began to decrease. Rodriguez was able to help them work through their conflict while teaching the watching children about empathy and problem-solving. Sarah used the incident as a teaching moment during the debrief session afterward. "What did you observe about the different approaches to handling the conflict?" she asked. "Rodriguez's method took longer," Davidson pointed out. "In a real emergency, you might not have time for extended discussion." "That's true," Sarah agreed. "But consider the outcomes. Davidson's approach stopped the immediate behavior but left the underlying problem unresolved. Rodriguez's approach took more time initially, but actually solved the conflict and taught valuable lessons to the other children watching." She looked around the group of cadets. Leadership isn't always about the fastest solution. Sometimes it's about the solution that has the best long-term results. Colin spoke up. "But what if you're in a situation where you don't have time for consensus building? What if immediate action is required?" "Then you take immediate action," Sarah replied. "But you also recognize that different situations require different approaches. A house fire requires immediate evacuation orders. A playground conflict requires patience and problem-solving. Good leaders know the difference." The discussion continued as they drove back to the academy, but Sarah could tell that some students were more receptive to the lessons than others. Davidson, Murphy, and Collins seemed to view the community center experience as an exception rather than a learning opportunity about adaptable leadership. That evening, Sarah was leaving the academy when she encountered the 3 cadets in the parking lot. They were talking animatedly among themselves, clearly continuing their discussion from the bus ride. "Miss Martinez," Davidson called out as she passed. "Can we ask you something?" Sarah paused, noting the challenging tone in his voice. "Of course. Some of us are wondering if the scenarios you're giving us are realistic," Davidson said. I mean, the community center was interesting, but how does that relate to military leadership or business management? Are we going to be spending a lot of time on feel-good exercises instead of practical skills?
Murphy nodded in agreement.
We're not saying it was bad, but we're here to learn leadership skills that will actually help us in our careers. Sarah looked at the three young men standing before her. They were polite and respectful, but there was an underlying arrogance in their questions. They seemed to believe that their future success was guaranteed and that they already understood what kind of leadership skills would be important. Tell me about your career goals, Sarah said. I'm planning to attend West Point and pursue a career as an Army officer, Davidson replied. My father was a colonel, and I want to follow in his footsteps. I'm looking at the Naval Academy, Murphy added. I want to be a Marine officer. Business school for me, Collins said. I'm interested in corporate leadership and eventually running my own company. Sarah nodded thoughtfully. All excellent goals. And you think that working with disadvantaged children has nothing to teach you about achieving those goals? Well, it's not that it has nothing to teach us, Davidson said carefully, but the skills required for military command or corporate management are probably different from the skills needed for working with kids. Are they? Sarah asked. You want to be an Army officer, Davidson. That means you'll be responsible for soldiers who might be 18 years old, away from home for the first time, scared, homesick, and dealing with life or death stress. How is that different from working with children who are dealing with trauma and uncertainty? Davidson looked uncomfortable. I suppose there are some similarities, but military personnel are trained to follow orders and maintain discipline. And what happens when that training isn't enough? Sarah pressed. What happens when you have a soldier who's breaking down under pressure, or having a panic attack, or making poor decisions because he's terrified?
Do you think ordering him to stop being scared is going to solve the problem?
Murphy and Collins exchanged glances. They were beginning to see where Sarah was heading with her questions.
Military leadership isn't just about giving orders and expecting compliance, Sarah continued. It's about understanding human psychology, building trust, and helping people perform at their best even under impossible circumstances. The same skills that help you connect with a traumatized child are the skills that help you lead a frightened soldier. She turned to Collins. And corporate leadership? You think managing employees is just about authority and decision-making? What happens when you have a team that doesn't trust your judgment, or when you need people to go above and beyond what their job descriptions require? Collins was quiet for a moment. I see your point about understanding people's motivations and building relationships. The fundamentals of leadership don't change based on the setting, Sarah said. Whether you're leading soldiers, managing employees, or working with children, you need to be able to understand what people need, communicate effectively, build trust, and solve problems in ways that bring out the best in others. Davidson still looked skeptical. But surely there's a difference between leadership that's based on authority and leadership that's based on popularity or emotional manipulation. Sarah felt her patience wearing thin. These young men seemed determined to maintain their narrow view of what leadership meant, despite evidence that their approaches had significant limitations. Let me tell you about real authority, she said, her voice taking on an edge that made all three cadets straighten up. Real authority comes from people believing that you have their best interests at heart, that you know what you're doing, and that you'll make good decisions even when those decisions are difficult. She stepped closer to them, and for the first time since they had known her, they could see something harder in her expression. You can't order people to trust you. You can't command them to respect you. And you can't force them to follow you into dangerous situations unless they believe you're worth following. The three cadets were completely silent now, sensing that something had shifted in the conversation. In combat, I led teams where people volunteered to follow me into situations where they might die, Sarah continued. Not because I outranked them, but because they trusted that I would do everything possible to bring them home alive. That kind of trust isn't built through authority. It's earned through competence, integrity, and genuine care for the people you're leading. Davidson found his voice. Ma'am, I didn't mean to imply that you...
You think working with those children today was a feel-good exercise? Sarah interrupted.
Those kids have been abandoned, abused, and disappointed by adults their entire lives. Getting them to trust you enough to learn something or even just to have fun for an afternoon, that's one of the hardest leadership challenges you'll ever face. She looked at each of them in turn. If you can't figure out how to connect with a scared 8-year-old, how do you think you're going to lead a terrified 19-year-old soldier? If you can't earn the respect of children who have every reason not to trust adults, how are you going to build loyalty among employees or subordinates? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Sarah could see that her words were having an impact, but she could also tell that the three young men were struggling with having their assumptions challenged so directly. I think we understand what you're saying, Davidson said finally. Maybe we need to think about leadership more broadly than we have been. Sarah softened her tone slightly. I'm not trying to attack your goals or your capabilities. You're all bright, talented young people with genuine leadership potential. But potential doesn't automatically translate into effectiveness. The difference between good leaders and great leaders is the willingness to keep learning and growing, even when that means admitting that your current approaches might not be sufficient. As the three cadets walked away, Sarah could see them deep in discussion. Whether they would genuinely reconsider their approaches to leadership remained to be seen, but at least she had planted some seeds of doubt about their certainty. The real test would come in the following weeks, as the scenarios became more challenging and the pressure to perform increased. Sarah designed the program to systematically strip away students' comfort zones and force them to confront the gaps between their self-perception and their actual capabilities. She was particularly curious to see how Davidson would respond to the challenge. His combination of intelligence, confidence, and arrogance made him both a promising student and a potential problem. If he could learn to incorporate humility and empathy into his leadership style, he could become truly exceptional. But if he remained convinced that authority and decisiveness were sufficient, he would likely become the kind of leader who achieved short-term results while damaging team morale and long-term effectiveness. The next phase of the program would test not just their problem-solving abilities, but their character under pressure. Sarah was about to discover which of her students had the potential for genuine leadership and which ones were simply good at following predetermined scripts for success. The turning point came during the 6th week of Sarah's leadership program. She had designed a complex multi-day exercise that would push the students beyond their comfort zones and force them to confront the reality of their leadership abilities under sustained pressure. The scenario was a wilderness survival simulation that would take place over a long weekend. 24 cadets would be divided into 4 teams of 6 people each, dropped at different locations in the Virginia mountains, and given minimal supplies. Their mission was to navigate to a rendezvous point while completing various challenges that would test their teamwork, decision-making, and leadership skills. What the students didn't know was that Sarah had built in several planned complications designed to create real stress and conflict. Some teams would face equipment failures. Others would encounter simulated injuries or discover that their maps contained deliberate errors. All teams would be monitored by hidden observers who would document their behavior when they thought no one was watching. Sarah had carefully constructed the teams to create specific dynamics. She wanted to see how students performed when removed from their familiar social structures and forced to work with people they didn't usually associate with. Davidson found himself teamed with Rodriguez, Maria Santos, James Kim, and 2 other students he barely knew, Rebecca Walsh and Thomas Chen. It was deliberately not a group he would have chosen, and Sarah could see his discomfort during the pre-exercise briefing. Each team will be given basic survival supplies and a topographical map, Sarah explained to the assembled students. Your objective is to reach the rendezvous point within 72 hours while completing 3 challenge stations along the way. You'll be evaluated on your teamwork, problem-solving, and leadership effectiveness. She paused, looking around at the expectant faces. I want to be clear about something. This is not a competition between teams. Each team will face different challenges, and success will be measured by how well you work together and adapt to changing circumstances. Murphy raised his hand. What happens if we don't make it to the rendezvous point in time? Then you'll learn something valuable about the consequences of poor planning and execution, Sarah replied. But more importantly, you'll discover something about how you handle failure and whether you can maintain team cohesion under pressure. The teams were transported to their starting locations early Friday morning. Davidson's team found themselves at the edge of a dense forest with a basic compass, a topographical map, some emergency supplies, and instructions for finding their first challenge station. Okay, first things first, Davidson said, automatically taking charge as the team gathered around the map. We need to identify our location and plot a route to the first checkpoint. Rodriguez examined the map more carefully. According to this, we're here, he pointed to a spot on the map, but I don't see the landmarks that should be visible from this position. Davidson looked around impatiently. Maps aren't always perfectly accurate. We need to get moving and adjust our navigation as we go. But if we start in the wrong direction, we could waste hours or even get completely lost, Maria Santos pointed out. Maybe we should take time to orient ourselves properly before moving. Analysis paralysis will kill us faster than a navigation error, Davidson replied, using one of his favorite phrases. We can correct course as we move. James Kim was studying the terrain around them. Actually, I think Rodriguez is right. The map shows a creek that should be visible from here, but I don't hear any water. We might not be where we think we are. Davidson felt his frustration mounting. This was exactly the kind of inefficient debate he had hoped to avoid. In his experience, teams worked best when someone took charge and made decisions quickly. But this group seemed determined to question every choice. Look, we can spend all day debating the perfect navigation strategy, or we can pick a direction and start moving, he said firmly. I've studied this map, I know how to use a compass, and I'm confident in the route I've plotted. Let's go. Without waiting for consensus, Davidson shouldered his pack and started walking in the direction he had chosen. After a moment of hesitation, the others followed, but Sarah's hidden observers noted the reluctant body language and exchanged glances among several team members. The first hour of hiking revealed that Davidson's navigation was indeed flawed. They encountered terrain features that didn't match their map and found themselves bushwhacking through dense underbrush instead of following the game trails that should have been visible. I think we need to reconsider our route, Rebecca Walsh said as they paused to rest. This terrain doesn't match what we should be seeing. We just need to push through this rough section, Davidson insisted. The trail will improve once we get over this ridge. But Rodriguez was examining the map and compass more carefully. I'm pretty sure we're actually about a mile south of where we think we are. If I'm right, we've been walking almost parallel to our intended route instead of toward the checkpoint. That's impossible, Davidson said. I've been checking our bearing regularly. Can I see the compass? James Kim asked. Davidson handed it over reluctantly. James examined it closely and then held it near his belt buckle. The needle swung wildly. The compass is being affected by the metal in your gear, James said. The readings have been off this whole time. The revelation was embarrassing for Davidson, who prided himself on his outdoor skills and navigation knowledge. But instead of acknowledging the error and adjusting their approach, he became defensive. Compass deviation is a normal issue in wilderness navigation, he said. I was compensating for it in my calculations, but we're still lost, Maria Santos pointed out practically. Whatever the cause, we need to figure out where we are and get back on track. Rodriguez had been studying the landscape and comparing it to the topographical map. I think if we backtrack about half a mile and then head northwest, we can intersect the trail we were supposed to be on. Backtracking wastes time and energy, Davidson objected. We should continue forward and try to intersect our route from this direction. But that means continuing to navigate by a compass that's giving us bad readings, James pointed out. We'll just get more lost. The argument continued for several minutes, with Davidson insisting on his approach and the rest of the team increasingly convinced that his navigation was flawed. Finally, Thomas Chen, who had been quiet up to this point, spoke up. This is crazy, he said. We're wasting more time arguing about the route than we would waste by backtracking. Can we just try Rodriguez's suggestion and see if it works? Davidson felt his authority slipping away. In every leadership scenario he had faced before, his combination of confidence and expertise had been sufficient to maintain control. But this group was actively challenging his decisions and proposing alternatives. Fine, he said tersely, but when Rodriguez's route doesn't work, we're going back to my original plan. The backtracking revealed that Rodriguez had been correct about their location. They were indeed off course, and his suggested correction put them back on track toward their first checkpoint. But Davidson's wounded pride prevented him from acknowledging the success of the alternative approach. When they reached the first challenge station, they found a scenario that required them to construct a shelter capable of protecting the team from a simulated severe weather event. They had limited materials and a 2-hour time limit. Davidson immediately began issuing instructions for shelter construction based on techniques he had learned in scouting. But Rebecca Walsh, who had grown up camping with her family, recognized that his approach wouldn't work well with the available materials. That design might work with proper poles and rope, she said, but we don't have the structural support we need. Maybe we should try something simpler but more stable. I've built dozens of shelters using this technique, Davidson replied. Trust me, it works. But as construction proceeded, it became clear that Rebecca was right. The shelter Davidson had designed required materials they didn't have, and his attempts to improvise substitutes were creating a structure that was both unstable and inadequate for weather protection. Meanwhile, Rodriguez and Maria Santos had quietly begun constructing an alternative shelter using a different approach. Their design was less ambitious but more practical, using the available materials more efficiently and creating better protection from the elements. We should combine our efforts, Rodriguez suggested diplomatically. Maybe use Davidson's basic framework but with some modifications based on what we've learned about the available materials. Davidson was faced with a choice. He could insist on his original design and likely fail the challenge, or he could acknowledge that his teammates had better ideas and incorporate their input. His pride and self-image as a natural leader pushed him toward the first option, but his practical intelligence suggested the second. "Fine," he said reluctantly. "But I still think my approach would work with better materials." The combined shelter construction was successful, but the process had revealed significant problems with team dynamics. Davidson's reluctance to acknowledge better ideas from his teammates was creating tension and inefficiency. Other team members were starting to work around him rather than with him. That evening, as the teams made camp, the hidden observers noted that Davidson's group had the most strained interpersonal relationships of all 4 teams. Davidson was increasingly isolated, with other team members forming a separate discussion group when planning the next day's activities. Sarah reviewed the observer reports that night and felt a mixture of concern and professional interest. The exercise was revealing exactly what she had hoped it would: the difference between students who understood collaborative leadership and those who confused authority with effectiveness. The second day brought more challenges and more friction. When Davidson's team encountered a simulated injury scenario where Rodriguez was designated as unconscious with possible spinal injuries, Davidson wanted to improvise a stretcher and attempt to carry him to the rendezvous point. Moving someone with a potential spinal injury without proper immobilization could cause permanent paralysis, Rebecca pointed out. "We should focus on stabilizing him here and signaling for help. We can't just sit here and wait," Davidson argued. "We have a mission to complete, and leaving Rodriguez behind isn't an option." "Nobody's talking about leaving him behind," Maria Santos said. "But we also can't risk making his injuries worse by moving him incorrectly." James Kim was examining the scenario instructions more carefully. "It says here that we have access to a radio for emergency communications. Maybe we should use it to call for medical evacuation instead of trying to transport him ourselves." "That's probably what they want us to do," Davidson said. "But real leaders don't give up on their missions just because they encounter complications. There has to be a way to complete the objective while taking care of Rodriguez." The argument revealed a fundamental difference in how Davidson and his teammates understood the priorities of leadership. Davidson was focused on mission completion and saw compromise as weakness. His teammates were focused on the welfare of their simulated casualty and saw Davidson's approach as reckless. Thomas Chen finally spoke up with frustration that had been building since the navigation problems of the first day. "This isn't about real leadership," he said. "This is about you needing to be right and in charge. Rodriguez gave us the correct navigation yesterday, and you fought him on it. Rebecca solved our shelter problem and you barely acknowledged her contribution. Now you want to risk paralyzing someone to avoid calling for help. When do you start listening to the rest of us?" The confrontation was direct and angry, cutting through the polite disagreement that had characterized their previous conflicts. Davidson's face flushed as he found himself being openly criticized by someone he considered a follower. "I've been making the best decisions I can based on the information available," Davidson replied defensively. "Leadership means making hard choices, even when they're unpopular."
"No," Maria Santos said firmly.
"Leadership means making good choices, even when they require you to admit that someone else has a better idea." Rodriguez, who was supposed to be unconscious for the simulation, opened his eyes. "Can I break character for a minute?" The team looked at him in surprise. "Davidson, you're a smart guy and you know a lot about outdoor skills and tactics," Rodriguez said. "But you're so worried about maintaining authority that you're not actually leading. You're just giving orders and expecting us to follow them, even when we have better ideas." "That's not true," Davidson protested. "I listened to input from the team." "When?" Rebecca asked. "When have you actually changed your mind based on something one of us said?" Davidson started to respond, then stopped. He realized that he couldn't think of a single example where he had altered his plans based on team input, even when that input had proved correct. "Leadership isn't about being right all the time," James Kim added. "It's about making the best decisions possible using all available resources, including the knowledge and skills of your team members." The simulated injury exercise ended with the team calling for medical evacuation, which turned out to be the correct response according to the scenario guidelines. But the real lesson had been the breakdown of team dynamics and Davidson's inability to acknowledge his teammates' expertise. That night, Sarah visited each team's campsite to check on their progress and observe their interactions. When she reached Davidson's group, she found them sitting in an awkward circle around their fire with obvious tension in the air. "How are things going?" she asked casually.
"It did damage my best."
"Fine," Davidson said quickly. We've completed all the challenges and we're on track to reach the rendezvous point tomorrow. Sarah looked around at the other team members. Their body language and expressions told a different story. Rodriguez, what's your assessment of the team's performance? She asked. Rodriguez glanced at Davidson before responding. We're getting the job done, but we're not working together as well as we could be.
Can you be more specific?
There was a long pause before Maria Santos spoke up. Some of us are having trouble with the collaborative aspects of leadership. There's a difference between making decisions and making good decisions with team input. Sarah nodded thoughtfully.